All right, hello, everybody. We're back. Can you hear us?
We can.
Fabulous. Thank you. So Justin is going to kick us off. He's got a meeting he's got to get to at 1. So we're going to have him do some of the policy updates for us and legislative update.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Denise. So I'm Justin Buttress, policy analyst in the State Forest Division. The State Forest Division's legislative coordinator as well. So kind of ride herd on the division's tracking of legislative bills that go through session and coordinating with the other divisions on the same. So just starting with some quick statistics, there have been 3,321 bills introduced, which I understand is a record. So this session, we're seeing a lot of bills introduced. ODF specifically, we're tracking 962 of those with some sort of priority. And in state forests, about 90 of those seem to have some sort of potential for impact or something that we need to be aware of anyway with those bills. So theme-wise, we're seeing a lot of bills around homelessness, administrative rules, of course, funding. Wildfire funding specifically is taking up a lot of airtime and a lot of attention at the Capitol. And then, of course, there's also been significant discussion on the wildfire hazard map. The next milestone in the session is March 21st. So all of the policy committees have to have work sessions scheduled by the 21st, excuse me, of March. So about 2 weeks from today, or those bills that are still in those committees and haven't been worked or haven't been scheduled for a work session are going to die. By April 9, the work session they had to have scheduled has to actually be held. So that's the first chamber deadline is what that's commonly referred to as. So out of those over 3,300 bills, only a small fraction of them will ever make it through the process. And this upcoming milestone, that's where most of them will die quietly in the dark. So so I'm just going to hit some of the highlights today. And as I move through them, I'm going to note which bills have made progress in the process. So I might mention a bill, and then if I don't say that, it's had a work session or a hearing or anything like that, or if there's nothing scheduled, that just might be its fate, or they just might not have gotten to it yet. So, but I'm going to try to note anywhere where something's actually been moving and that sort of thing. So, so starting with our high priority bills, we kind of rank all of the bills as we're evaluating those for really, major impacts, sort of moderate impacts, maybe minor or low impact, and then stuff that we just pay attention to. We call them watch bills, either because we need to have some awareness of the bill, the law that's changing or potentially changing with that, so that we know what the situation is there, or because the bill might be amended in the future, and if it gets amended, then it could have an impact on us. So we would continue to track that. So starting with the high priority stuff, the sort of the highest impact, probably the most significant on those is House Bill 3103. This bill is a bill that requires state forests to do harvest level rulemaking. So we would have to basically calculate our harvest level, which we do currently in our IPs, as Colleen and her team were talking about this morning. The difference there would be taking that number and putting it into administrative rule. So that's kind of the general concept of it. That one had a hearing on the 3rd on a -1 amendment. There hasn't been a work session scheduled, but we are anticipating that this one's going to kind of keep moving. There's a possible for a -2 amendment on that one. The bill concept is fine in theory on this one. It really just seeks to hold ODF accountable for setting a harvest level and ensuring we achieve it. The specific bill language, excuse me, and here I'm referring to the -1. the introduced bill had a lot of issues as well, but the Dash one continues to have some technical issues with it, specifically setting up a situation that undermines the board's discretion in setting management policy for the forests. It has the potential to create unsustainable harvest in some scenarios, and it would potentially increase our litigation risk pretty drastically. So we've got our eyes closely on that one, and we've been working with the co-chairs of the House Natural Resource and Everything Else Committee, Helm and Owens, along with some stakeholders that want to see this one get through to try to find something that will work for all of us. The next one is Senate Bill 179. That one deals with recreational immunity. There's a handful of bills dealing with recreational immunity, and the intelligence that I've received is that Senate Bill 179 is the one that's going to. And so that one had a work session on the 3rd of March, where they adopted a Dash 1 and moved that to the Senate floor for a vote. The bill, what it does is just takes the correction that was made in the 2024 short session for recreational immunity following a court case out in Newport. And that bill in 2024 had a sunset provision. What this one does is basically just removes that sunset and makes that fix from 2024 permanent. The Dash 1 just makes it clear that that bill is not retroactive. The law change is not retroactive, so that it doesn't have a chilling effect on current litigation that's working its way through the courts. And then it changes horse as it appears in the recreational immunity statutes to equine, so that things like zebras and donkeys are also included and not just horses. Yeah, they even asked, what about Shetland ponies? Well, okay, I think it's all equine, but here we go. Like I said, other bills related to recreational immunity don't appear to be moving this session. There's also kind of related to that House Bill 3140. That one was dealing with liability waivers, more so for like ski slopes and that sort of thing. Those concessionaires that are running ski destinations, chairlifts and the such, they would have you sign a liability waiver or potentially accept a liability waiver by participating in those activities and buying a lift ticket. And there was a court case that sort of undermined that. So House Bill 3140 is attempting to fix that. That bill is just sitting in judiciary. It hasn't moved yet. House Bill 3894 would permit ODF to lease state forest lands for wind energy facilities. This bill just simply adds to the list of things that we're permitted to do in ORS 53050 to achieve greatest permanent value. It doesn't say that we have to, so we retain all the discretion there. And so that seems like a fine thing to provide that option, and we'll see where that one goes. There's a handful of, or a couple of tribal engagement bills that we're tracking that are pretty important as well. House Bill 2069 and House Bill 3531. So 2069 creates a task force on tribal engagement. That one's been passed from committee to Ways and Means, and really just requires all state agencies to cooperate with that task force. And that task force is attempting to increase tribal engagement between the state and those sovereign nations. House Bill 3531 would require the Legislative Commission on Indian Services to hire a tribal liaison position to work with natural resource agencies. That one's not moved at all. And so I would just note that these are sort of really largely consistent with the increased effort that we've been doing both in state forests and as the Department of Forestry to increase our engagement with the federally recognized tribes that are here in Oregon. So those are the highest impact, highest priority bills, the ones that seem like they're getting some traction. There's also a handful of bills that I would say are high impact, but don't appear to have a very high likelihood of moving this session. So there's 3 bills that would require state forests to reconvey lands from state ownership back to the counties if the county's asked. That's House Bill 3455 and Senate Bills 404 and 876. There's Senate Bill 455 that requires a study to do the economic impacts of the HCP, the state forest HCP specifically. Related, there's Senate Bill 1058 that requires changing the HCP to reflect Alternative 5 and then submit that revised HCP to the Federal Services for the HCP for the incidental take permits. House Bill 3846 would allow ODF to lease the Ochoco National Forest for a period of not less than 15 years for management, which would basically double our acreage and our footprint for management out there in the landscape. House Bill 2295 is one of those other recreational immunity bills. That one was seeking to go after users' intent, whether they were sort of intending to recreate, whether they were intending, or whether they actually were actively recreating or not at the moment, which is just another one of those things that in response to the Newport case, trying to fix recreational immunity. Then there's House Bill 3251, which would, for Clatsop and Tillamook counties, fix our lease rates for cell phone towers to $1,500 a year, and require us to just go ahead and lease those out if so asked by those telcos. So those are the high impact ones that, like I said, don't seem to be moving, but one can never tell. There's also a handful of lower priority bills that are potentially moving through or just might die as well, but these are low impact, so we're tracking them, we're paying attention, but if they pass, it's not going to be earth shattering for any of our business lines. There's, as I mentioned previously, a big theme around administrative rules. So there's 10 bills of note that we're tracking there. For the sake of time, I probably am not going to go through all of those, but there's a couple that have had hearings. So House Bill 2692, that one would require an advisory committee to be convened prior to rulemaking. So currently that's an option for rulemaking, and this one would require it. That one had a hearing back on February 12th and hasn't had a work session scheduled since. Kind of related to that, House Bill 3569 would require that if we're convening a RAC, that we have to invite the chief sponsor from the legislature of the bill that created that rulemaking. So that one's kind of interesting. Hasn't had a hearing or anything, but I believe that one has bipartisan support. So we'll see where that one goes. And yeah, that's probably all that's worth mentioning on administrative bills, administrative rule bills, I should say. There's also House Bill 2977, which would increase the transient lodging tax. So for all of our state forest campgrounds, we pay the transient lodging tax. There's a statewide tax, and then so some counties have a transient lodging tax as well. So we don't collect that in addition to our campground fee. That's taken out of the campground fee, and then we distribute the net off of that. So any increase in transient lodging tax just reduces the amount of revenue that comes in off of those, which admittedly isn't much when we're talking about campground fees, but every bit counts. And then there's a handful of bills that we're tracking that either don't have any impact or maybe a very low impact, but we need to make sure we're tracking those so we understand how the law might be changing, or in the case of amendment. So House Bill 2558 modifies the definition of a charter guide. That one has moved out of committee and is sitting in Ways and Means. There's numerous bills, 10 of them related to homelessness. So far, none of those actually have an impact on the state. Most of them are targeting the city and county ordinance portions of that issue. But we pay close attention to those to make sure that we're understanding the law and how it's changing and recognizing those impacts as a public land manager. There's a few off-highway vehicle bills. House Bill 2232 transfers some of the OHV standards to OPRD from ODOT or I think DEQ is the other entity that has some of those regulations currently. That one has passed the House and is scheduled for a third reading in the Senate on Monday. So that one's actually really, really close to being ready for the governor's signature. Excuse me, House Bill 3155 allows some use of OHVs on highways. It has a hearing, had a hearing, excuse me, on February 10th. And then there's House Bill 3678, which allows OHV use on county roads if county wants to pass ordinances to that effect. Senate Bill 378, continuing the theme of recreation. That one provides free access to Oregon senior citizens to Oregon state parks, OPRD's state parks. What we've experienced in the past is that people realize that they get free camping on state parklands, or there's some program on state parklands that doesn't extend to forestry, and we get asked to go ahead and extend that same courtesy through legislation later on. So we're tracking that one, so we know where that goes and expecting that they just might ask us next. There's also a handful of bills around corrections facilities, staffing, or adults in custody. So House Bill 2312, 3269, 2475, and then Senate Bills 197 and 263. None of those are moving, but of course with our South Fork Forest Camp, where we're jointly managing that facility with Department of Corrections. So we always want to make sure we're tracking the bills and the laws that are changing there. So that's kind of the list of high priority things for the division. There's a handful more that I would say rise to the level of being more agency level priority bills. So I'll run through those real quick, and then I think we'll have some time for questions or discussion, and we'll go from there. So Senate Bill 494, this one seems to be getting some good traction. This one requires the Department of Administrative Services, DAS, to study the classification and compensation of forestry workers. So a lot of the focus is, of course, on wildland firefighter retention, but it's the bill is more broad than just wildland firefighters. But it's that's kind of the impetus there. That's been passed to Ways and Means from the Senate committee. So seems like that has a very good likelihood of passing through this session. House Bill 2817 is a forestry legislative concept that's become a bill. This one removes from our fire closure statutes. We have 3 levels of closure that we currently have there in statute. This would remove one of those, because if it turns out we just don't use it, and there's no need. So just sort of cleaning up the statutes there. So this would remove the permit closure specifically from that. That's passed from the House and is over in the Senate side now. And the other legislative concept turned bill that we have is House Bill 2819. This one is for our fire wardens to have citation authority in situations where maybe they didn't directly witness somebody starting a fire, but they're holding a gas can and a match. So, you know, pretty good odds we could still write them a citation. and let that go to the legal process there. We're currently, if we caught somebody sort of almost red-handed like that, we couldn't write that ticket. So that one was scheduled for a work session yesterday, but didn't actually get worked in the committee. So hasn't been rescheduled, but that committee hasn't sent out its schedule for next week yet. So perhaps this afternoon even it'll show up on next week's roster. Senate Bill 1051 transfers the appointment of the state forester to the governor and then confirmed by the Senate. We're currently that appointment, the hiring and firing and that sort of thing resides with the Board of Forestry. It also expands currently the state forester. There's a statutory requirement that the state forester be a practical forester with certain knowledge. This would allow for the deputy state forester to fill that gap if the state forester, he or herself, did not have that that particular set of skills. So so there's that one. So really, that would potentially broaden the candidate pool, and then it changes who's supervising that position. House Bill 2072 is the harvest tax bill, everybody's favorite topic every session. So every biennium that has to be renewed, and it funds a lot of different programs. There's always a discussion as well about a severance tax, and that's no different this time around. It's in House Bill 3489. So those are, two big tax bills that are, of course, always a priority for us. A lot of attention kind of paid to last year's fire season and how much of that wildland fire was actually on rangeland. And so there's a bill that's looking to pay some attention to those rangeland fire protection associations, and that's House Bill 3349. And then last, there's House Bill 3666, which looks to do some certification for utilities in the context of wildland fire, to make some improvements there around risk and liability. So that's the summary, and I'm happy to, if there are questions or discussion or anything that you've been hearing that I didn't talk about, got more time.
Great. Any comments or questions?
Hey, Justin, Amanda, Associated Oregon Loggers. Thanks for being here today. Can you just clarify the comment around 3103 and around how the sustainable harvest calculation would result in an unsustainable harvest?
Could.
Or could.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So it creates a situation where effectively it creates a legal right or property right to a certain level of harvest for a period of time. The way the bill is written, it's a 10-year period. So let's say that number is 100 for that 10-year period, and 5 years in, the Board of Forestry. So this actually answers sort of two aspects of my comments earlier, where I said it undermines the board authority to manage the forest, and then it creates unsustainability in some scenarios. So the Board of Forestry evaluates, through performance measures and adaptive management, what's going on with the forest, and they want to make a management change, and say that reduces harvest levels to 80 from 100. The way the bill is drafted, those arrears have to be made up in the next period. So if we say that next 10-year period, so if we say, okay, well, we can drop our harvest level to 80 from 100 because that's what's needed to manage our forest for greatest permanent value in the board's discretion, that 20 still has to get tacked on to the next period. So you still end up with 100. It's just carried over into the next period, which is creating that then unsustainable situation where if you had to reduce the acreage on which you can operate in order to achieve that 80, to achieve other goals, then you're just harvesting more. You're trying to harvest more off of, a smaller land base potentially. Same could be true if we had an uplisting or a new listing of a species that's not covered by the HCP, or if we just goof up the modeling and there's some assumptions that are incorrect in our modeling, and we go, oh, geez, okay, we need to make a correction because we're halfway through here and we realize that we're overdoing it. What we're doing isn't sustainable. Well, we can't pull back on that over harvest because the way it's set up, we have to make up the arrearage or be sued, and that's the situation that's there. So it doesn't allow the board to make policy decisions. The way the bill is drafted, it makes up for catastrophic wildfire or insect and disease or something like that. If the forest condition changes as a result of storm damage, that would be fine. That's not going to create an issue with sustainability moving forward. But a policy choice or an error in professional judgment or modeling or something along those lines that creates a situation where a change is needed is not something that's allowed by the bill.
Lisa.
Yes, hi, this is Lisa from Astoria. I just had a question about the bill on administrative rulemaking. I've done administrative rulemaking on one legislative experience, the Toxic Free Kids Act, and in that, in doing so, I thought we were in an advisory group. I mean, I was with a lot of people, many lawyers, I might add, which kind of blew my mind, how many lawyers, because the Toxic Free Kids Act, related to any product that came into Oregon that was specifically for children. So that was a lot of toy manufacturers, I mean, just jewelry manufacturers, I mean, just everybody. And we also tied into the legislator who sponsored the bill continually, just to make sure that we had an understanding of their intent. So when you say that this particular rule or this particular bill addresses those two things, are you saying that what we did was voluntary, and that somebody could just tell one person to do all the administrative rules and don't check on the sponsor? That's how rulemaking is generally? Oh, okay.
That's the floor. So it's governed by the Administrative Procedures Act, which is in 183, ORS Chapter 183. But it describes how a state agency has to do rulemaking, and it's discretionary as to whether or not you convene a rules advisory committee, or a RAC, as we often call them. If you do convene a RAC, then there are certain requirements, but it's optional. And there's nothing in there currently about having to run back to the legislature, to the committee, or to the chief sponsor of the bill, or anything like that, as you're doing that rulemaking. So it's an interesting situation in Oregon, because really administrative rules it's a delegation of legislative authority to the executive branch. Mm-hmm. So from a governance perspective, it's a little bit of a power share from the legislature to the executive branch, and I think a lot of that is just the history of us using sort of part-time citizen legislators in this state. And so the result is, though, a lot of those legislators then feel like they're giving up too much of that authority. They recognize that they're sharing some of the authority, but probably want a correction, want to pull some of that back. So there's always a lot of bills that seek, and that this is this is no different this year. A lot of bills looking to pull back some of that authority from the executive branch and put it back with the legislature. So some of the other ones I didn't really talk about, but Senate Bill 895 requires an agency to appear before a legislative committee if the legislative committee or enough legislators object to a rule. You know, they can call us to the carpet directly on that. Senate Bill 411 would actually have administrative rules go back to the legislature for approval before they could be finalized. There is, let's see, Senate Bill 483 is a study bill for the Legislative Policy and Research Office, LPRO, to find methods for legislative oversight of OARs. So kind of running the gamut of like, we want to know more about the situation. We want, to have a study bill on that to like, here are some very specific things that we want to do to exercise some additional oversight and authority over that executive branch rulemaking. So, yeah, so the short answer is yes, what you did was voluntary. It wasn't required. But in that case, whoever was doing the rulemaking, that agency made a choice to be more involved and involve the legislature more frequently in that. And that's not completely uncommon, but there's lots of rules that, that doesn't happen with.
I see. Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any other comments? Yeah, Barrett.
Justin Barrett here. On that statutory harvest level bill, I'm sorry, I didn't remember the bill number. Wasn't that if that target is 100 and you, the board fell back to 80, for example, for 1 year, that you had to be at 120 the following year?
Yeah, it's House Bill 3103, and kind of. So it's written as a decade. So if we fell short in that decade, so if it's 100 a year and we fell back to 80 for 1 year, then that 20 would have to be made up in the next 10 years. So it's not. It's a little more flexibility. If we were short 1 year for some reason, we could or could not make that up in the next year, assuming that it's not year 10.
Okay. Thank you. And then on the on Senate Bill 179, that landowner immunity, recreation immunity bill, that I would just encourage you to you can only do so much. I'm sorry. Let's see.
We can neither support nor.
Yeah, no. I'll just say the City and County Insurers Association, which is the small cities and counties that pooled into an association, self-insured. They've agreed that they can write policies for cities and counties if this bill passes. That's really all that achieves. It doesn't really fix the exposure, all the weaknesses in that statute. And that means a lot for state forest lands. I mean, the tens of thousands of people who set foot on to recreate on state forests as well as private forests still have this wide open field for litigation. And the legislature, left to its own devices, just does not want to close those avenues for litigation. They like this issue in the Supreme Court every 2 years, and that's really bad for us. So
yeah. I'm
just communicating that this is a temporary fix that lets those cities and counties get their insurance and open a little few trails that they were worried about, but there's still a lot of work to do. So that's the messaging. I'm hoping people don't think this fixes it. It's just temporary, in my view. They think it fixes it.
Yeah, thanks for that context, Barrett. It's definitely true. It's not a complete fix. It's a marginal improvement, incremental improvement that we've been seeing, every couple of years on the topic. I think I heard Dan say as much, but as an executive branch agency, we're neutral. We take no position on any of these bills. So um, we we have to take the governor's lead as to whether or not we're engaged in a topic, and if we can adopt a position. We can't just do that unilaterally or under our own authority. So we weren't invited to participate in any sort of discussions around recreational immunity following the last short session, which is something that was supposed to happen. It was a Band-Aid fix in the short session on recreational immunity, and then a work group is supposed to come up with some ideas for how to permanently fix it. I don't know that group really even met, but we at Forestry weren't invited to engage in that. So
Yeah, they,
oops.
Oh, I got it. Go ahead.
sure.
Yep.
They did meet, but they didn't do anything. So we,
Okay.
I'm going to be part of putting together a task force on that.
Yeah.
That question this summer. And some land manager, there'll be some role for a recreation land manager in that. In that process.
Turn your volume off.
Echo.
I'm still changing. That's it. So
Eric, stop it.
No.
My ears can't take it.
I hate to cut all of this short, but I do have a cutoff here. Unfortunately, I've got a high priority meeting that I have to jump to. But if there is any other questions or other bills or anything like that you want to discuss with me, definitely shoot me an email, give me a call, message me on Teams or video chat on Teams. Any of those things works. Happy to discuss those things if there's concerns or questions or whatever. So thanks everyone for your time today.
Yeah, can I ask one question just generally? Yeah. One question maybe, I know Justin just left, but I don't think that he mentioned, I didn't hear him mention your guys' budget bills up in Ways and Means sub, right, next week?
Tuesday, Wednesday, yeah.
Okay. Just want to highlight that. I don't know that he mentioned that, so. But since we talked a little bit about other budget stuff, related to some of the wildfire funding and how you guys may be using that in state forests to achieve some of your conservation work. Just something to know.
And the public hearing is on Wednesday.
And our presentations, for anybody who's interested and doesn't have anything better to do. Monday from 2 to 4, we're scheduled for the presentation on the overall agency stuff, administrative services and all that kind of stuff. And then the 3 divisions will be giving our presentations on Tuesday from looks like 3 to 4:30.
Thanks, Mike.
Are there, I guess just really quick, are there any POPs that directly affect state forests? Other than maybe some of the is there some capital projects for buildings?
Yeah, so one of the things in there for capital stuff, most directly related to state forests, there's Saniam office, of course, that got burned down. And then there's also the new office the new office in Toledo won't have any state forest function. So really the Saniam is pretty much it. And no other pops, of course, for state forests.
Sorry, Chair.
All right, I kind of relaxed in like I was done. I was not done. Okay, so kind of picking up where we left off. So we talked about targets, the preliminary stuff that's going on here. And then I'm going to go into just talking about some of the resource considerations that kind of pop up during our public comment period and that are often of interest here. So one of the big, there's a little bit of a lag, so, and I will try to zoom in. Nope, that's not gonna work either, never mind. Hopefully your eyes are better than mine. So, you know, habitat conservation areas are one of the strategies that we're implementing with the AOP or the annual operations plan. And it's also a topic that comes up a little bit different. One of the big questions last year, like in our summary documents, we had the number of acres that we were doing within the habitat conservation area. This year, we're going to be adding in how much volume we're doing specifically in those areas. These are areas that are designed to conserve kind of the highest quality existing covered species habitat, and nearly all the known occupied parts of the permit area. However, given the size, disturbance, and management history, there are many areas of lower quality habitat. Since the overarching management objective for the habitat conservation areas is to increase the quality and quantity of habitat for terrestrial covered species, we're doing some management in those. For healthy conifer, on average, will be, you know, as we transition into the plan, as it's getting approved, it'll be up to about 1,500 acres of thinning in the healthy conifer stands. And then for the Swiss needlecast and the hardwood stands, it's an average of about 500 acres a year in those two categories. Those two categories can be combined to make 1,000 acres a year. So you could do 1,000 acres a year of Swiss needlecast one year and then 1,000 acres of hardwood the next year. It doesn't stipulate on that. So this year, we're definitely starting to add some more sales to these. We're not quite up to where we will be as we develop the new IP and we get the coverage of the incidental tank permit, just because of survey logistics and costs and us still working under take avoidance. But we're really looking at primaries and alternates combined about 632 acres of the healthy conifer for about 5.4 million board feet. And then for the hardwood Swiss needlecast nominated stands, about 337 acres for a total volume of 8.8 million. So I'm gonna stop there and see if there's. Okay, northern spotted owl and marble murrelet habitat. We definitely have kind of reduced down how much we're working in these types of areas, especially because of where the habitat conservation areas are on the landscape. So whenever we're operating within the vicinity to known spotted owls or marble murrelets, there are a number of checks that we do in conjunctions with the biologists to ensure that operations meet the policies in these areas. The districts and the biologists have worked together to review these areas, determine the appropriate prescriptions, and to develop biological assessments or habitat assessments to meet the federal requirements. There are 2 sales in the Southwest unit that are inside of owl circles and will require biological assessments. These are the wind chime and windy gust sales. And then the Veneta unit, which is also in the Western Lane District, is under the Safe Harbor Agreement. And it has 1 sale at Nelson Nebulous, which will require a habitat assessment. So you guys will see that in the annual operations plan. Okay. So we talked a little bit earlier about current condition complex, and we call it complex because it's kind of a mix of layered stands that stands that are currently layered, forest condition, or older forest structure condition. So I think this number looks like it's added up incorrectly. That was my bad. So you can see here, Astoria has 429 acres of complex condition, and it's a mix of layered and OFS that are going to be clear cutting, and then 23 acres of partial cut. Forest Grove is 161 and 18 acres of partial cut. North Cascade has 32 acres. Tillamook has 177 acres and 48 acres of partial cut. And then West Oregon has 26 acres of clear cut, and Western Lane has 94 acres. That number is wrong, but my calculator is underneath the slideshow. So I think the biggest thing here is that we just know that this is kind of a hot topic, and this is one of those things in implementation of implementation, like on the ground of the revisions that we're doing in our implementation plans. That is going to be, I think it's going to be a catalyst. I think there's going to be a lot of discussion, a lot of frustration around that we're harvesting larger, more mature, older stands. They use a variety of words to describe these areas. The interesting thing is last year there were a lot of stands that didn't actually meet the metrics of current condition complex, but they just met, they were 75 years old. Some people were frustrated with 60 years old. Some were frustrated with 90 years old. So it really is kind of value-based of where that kind of threshold is. And really, we're just anchoring into our policies, the direction that we've been given, and the IP revisions that we're doing. But it definitely will come in the public comment that we're receiving.
Yeah, the total acres is 919. Thank you.
You're welcome. Appreciate that. And this was, and Derek, you can correct me if I'm wrong, this is about where we were last year, maybe a little less.
It's so, and one just minor change after we went through is, so the partial cut's actually zeroed out now because those are all incidental acres that were incorrect SLI numbers.
Oh, they were.
And so, where stand boundaries were on edges across. And so those are actually zeros for the partial cut, but it's a little more than last year, but not staggeringly so.
And these are both primaries and alternates.
Correct.
So,
and last year we reported out on just the primaries.
yeah, folks, one of the things we're realizing in public comment is that they don't really alternate, because it can move up, is just getting the same amount of concern and opinions about those just as much as the primaries. So we're just reporting out on all of them because they don't see the distinction between the two, or they do, but it's still something that they're concerned about.
Have you thought about during this transition between reporting it, making that clear that it's not this doesn't represent a radical increase. It's a change in reporting.
This is reporting is just for you. We do it different in the AOP reports. It's like specific, like what condition,
Sure.
how many acres, in both in the pre-op reports, pre-operations reports, and then in the sales summaries. So
Appreciate that.
Is this, are all of this condition complex areas that were moved into, are these all the areas that we're now harvesting because they're outside of the HCA's? Or does this constitute areas that we were already going to harvest in that had complex features? Like, is there a combination
I do
there?
think
It's both.
It's both.
Yeah.
Okay. Just again, trying to like level set with everybody in the room.
Yeah.
But that's part of what we were talking about earlier, where the conversation is important, and it's kind of that conversation of, maybe even adding on here like current condition complex outside of HCA's.
Yeah.
In general harvest areas. But yeah, that's that. Do you want us to operate under the outlines of the HCP in good faith, or do you not? So
Yeah.
this is us doing that.
Well, and it's also technically outside of the current landscape design for the current FMP. So it's typing out as current complex, but it has no conservation designation. It's not,
Okay.
It's not an HPCA.
Okay, so that's good. Yeah, good context.
Yep.
And so I assume, and I have not read the IP yet, so I
Yeah.
don't know how it's worded in there, but.
It was DFC like 6 months ago. Yeah, so-
I did make a note that we can list that to kind of beef that up in our descriptions if we need to say outside of HCA's. I think that's a great way to like point to that. It doesn't necessarily seem to matter, but I do think if it was DFC, I think it will get more attention for the folks that's really important to desired future conditions, sorry. For those folks that it's important to, but it's something we've been doing slowly as things grow in locations that were targeted for that don't have constraints on it. So, but just a good one to keep in mind.
I'll say too, for the most part, there's a reason why most of these didn't go into habitat conservation areas, despite having been DFC complex. They're generally smaller parcels, they're generally more isolated, or they had no covered species occupancy history. And so the thought was their contribution to the covered species is very limited. We have to make trade-offs. These were purposefully left out for a number of reasons, but mostly to allow for there to be mature volume outside of habitat conservation areas. So that this was the intent from the get-go. And these aren't the most valuable old complex stands we have for wildlife, not by a long shot. That's not to say they don't have value. So like, don't pretend they're worthless, but yeah, that was the.
And I think the other thing too is the model is using this volume for our sustainable harvest levels. It's harvesting these, it harvests these first to let our younger stands grow older. And that's kind of the modeling that we've been using. And so by doing some of these every year, we're kind of offsetting some of the younger or less complex stands that we're doing. But it's also letting the stands that are 30 to 60 years old grow longer, if that's the rotation feature that we have. So yeah, this is our current forest management plan managed under that kind of concept of where we do the older stands and let the younger stands grow. And that's where we are still in this transition.
Just in case anybody else has last year's presentation memorized, that 466 was the number last year, but it was only for primary sales. It did not include the alternates.
Yeah.
And so when I said that this year was an increase, it's because this year that 919 number that it is now includes both the alternates and the primaries, where last year that 466 was only the primary sales.
That's a happy accident mistake. We could just compare the two. Okay, so any questions on that? This does represent kind of an age range of 70 to like 120 these stands in here. So yeah, we're definitely in the transition period. All right. Part of our yearly planning process is identifying stream enhancement opportunities. The first initial screen done by our aquatic specialists is done in conjunction with ODF and W biologists. And this year it's identified a variety of options as we move into the sale planning process. Not all of these will ultimately be done, but this list will be reviewed more in depth in the coming months to determine the priority projects that will have the highest impact and align with our operators and capacity, and can be completed with grants or timber sales in order to minimize costs or in conjunction with our watershed councils. All of these projects that are on the list are opportunities for wood placement, but the Western Lane one that it has an asterisk on it is actually a removal of 2 fish pipes and then a vacation of the road. So that's where we're at. Any questions on that? Just because we were talking about streams, I added kind of the local domestic water resources slide here, but this will be part of the bigger conversations we talk about public engagement. Each year we screen all of the sale candidates for nearby domestic water or points of diversion. While our general stream protection rules for the forest management plan and the Habitat Conservation Plan, the protections meet or exceed the Forest Practices Act around domestic water sites. At times, we do some additional efforts that we can take near the locations to help alleviate any outstanding concerns. So that's a tool in the district's toolbox as they kind of work through those issues. During the planning process, different tools are used when evaluating these resources. We determine if the domestic site is currently in use. We identify the landowner associated with the domestic site, and then planning efforts to discuss planned activities and potential mitigation efforts. We also look at the buffer requirements and potential legacy tree strategies to incorporate in key locations, if that makes sense. And so, I think we've done varying levels of the outreach depending on the district and the neighbor. And I think that's getting more standardized as we move forward through this process. But you can see here, we have quite a few on Astoria, several on Forest Grove, and then also one in Western Lane.
And these are all community water sources?
These are just, they could range from just one intake or a domestic water source that's identified to community.
Well,
I'm
quickly,
not sure exactly.
for Astoria, E-Rock and Middle Big Noise, that's the Napa Water District, which are wells. So there's no surface water there. Sager is a known water source. We've had multiple operations nearby. No issues there. And then Vesper is an unknown water. It's on the books, but no one knows where it really is.
Technically, E-Rock actually does have an overland flow, but it's not one that's ever been in use by the Napa Water Association.
And luckily, we know somebody who's on the Napa Water Board.
Yeah.
First to Forest Grove must be the Southport Camp water supply.
Jordan Lida is.
Well, I guess I'd speak to that a little more. I mean, because people have been bringing up, public water as a very important resource, and totally agree, and we're all supportive of that. But a lot of times things are brought up as facts that aren't facts. So the more we can get our ducks in a row to talk about clean drinking water, the better we are, because we got beat up pretty good during the last public comment period about public drinking water. And there were no water sources in any of the sales that were brought up. But yet that was one of the main topics that was brought up again and again.
I think most people see that and they think the water source is in the sale. So it's good to clarify.
Yeah, and this, again, the slide is just kind of awareness for us. One of the things we realized is we have always used the pre-operations report as a communication tool with our foresters, and then we make them available for the public. And so if you just look at that section, it's very like there is a water source 3,000 feet or within 3,000 feet, check yes. We will, evaluate during field layout. And there's no we've checked these water source or these databases, and that's the language that I think we need to just add a little bit in just to show our due diligence, like a sentence here, or a sentence there that just shows hey, we checked the databases, we looked at these things, we didn't find anything, or we did, if nothing else, so we can point back to it. In the past, it's just been kind of a yes, no, with if there was a yes, kind of what the next steps are. So there's some work there for us to do just to clarify and communicate better. I don't know if we may still get the same comments, but at least we've checked the box of providing the information for them to at least understand what we've done. Okay. Recreation.
All right, so looking at this AOP, a couple things just want to mention. I know we talked about this last year, maybe even 2 years now. We've looked at recreation AOPs, and we'll talk about this here in the next presentation about recreation planning, but we're kind of getting to the tail end of specific rec plans. And so we really focus more on maintenance of things that we do have on the landscape, and also taking budget instructions into account too. So nothing major changing from, or no major changes, I should say, from last year, but really gonna be focusing primarily on maintenance. And so there has been a limited amount of new projects, which I think are on the next slide. Yep. And so, yep, all of these projects, as you'll see, are very heavily focused on taking care of a lot of the aquatic resource connections that we do have on specifically OHV trails. I believe every single one of the either trail construction or installations or reroutes are all related to habitat conservation plan or just basic aquatic resource interactions. So that's a big part of what we're working on. And additionally, another thing that is on there is the planning phase for a CXT bathroom, just a classic vault bathroom. And so again, that's a kind of a response to resource needs that we have in areas where we certainly have recreation and we don't have permanent bathrooms, I guess, which ends up being a big part of what we have. So everything that we're doing this year is really focused on maintenance and also just taking care of the connections we have with aquatic resources.
Is that the restroom that we received a lot of comments on?
Yeah, pictures.
It is. Yes. Yeah, which is another good point that we are very responsive. Yes.
Bathroom comments.
Very responsive to bathroom
A lot of
comments.
comments about bathroom. This specific bathroom.
And
I wanted to point that out, sorry.
You know, actually, it was very impressive, the coordinated communication on that.
People made trips to it.
Yes. Yeah.
Like today.
Yeah. Yeah. I believe that's all we have for this.
This is just.
And then again, just the last little piece, just for awareness.
I'm like.
And we do talk about this every time, just that, you know, anytime there are interactions or there are timber sales across the landscape with certainly on the Tillamook district and Forest Grove district, there's going to be interactions with trail systems as well. And so just a kind of a heads up on the amount of interactions that are taking place, because that does end up becoming a big part of the operational impacts to the recreation program and also to the timber sales as well.
So this one's actually a 2-slider. And so the first one is every sale but Tillamook.
Yeah.
And then the second slide is Tillamook, and the Tillamook is where the majority of our trails reside. And so it makes sense that that's also where the majority of the interactions are.
Any thoughts or questions on the recreation? Public engagement. Okay, so as we talked about, one aspect of the planning process that we've heard a lot of frustration and opinion since our last public comment period is about how we conduct public engagement, especially around landowner notification. But there are also a lot of requests for additional information or clarity in our reports, a lot of requests for specific tours, specific meetings around a whole variety of topics, and the questions about how folks can better influence and change plans to their desired outcome. And I think that's key, because I think a lot of it is not just we want to engage, but we want you to do what we want you to do. And how do we do that more effectively? And I think that that's such a hard thing, because it's so individual, but two, we have a very narrow scope of decision space through our plans that we have. So we talked about in our last couple of meetings about kind of the overlapping constraints, and the things that aren't constrained are where we can operate. So we have to operate there in order to meet our harvest objectives. And so and then we talked about where the HCAs are on the landscape. And now we're, working in some of it. We're working in older stands, kind of all the resource considerations that we just talked about, plus a kind of a higher direct correlation to adjacent landowners. And so that's just something I want you guys to think about as we talk through public engagement and how we can do better. We're not going to satisfy everyone. We're not going to do it well. So how do we balance the workload, but still being reactive to the comments and the feedback that we're getting? So in this portion of the presentation, I'm going to walk through, I got to figure out where I'm at. I'm going to walk through what we're currently doing for public engagement and then what we're working to improve this year. At the end, I'd like to get your thoughts and feedback on what we're doing and our plans going forward, and any suggestions you would have for us to consider. We're going to take any feedback that we receive today and then help us finalize our engagement plans over the next weeks, so it can be ready to implement towards the end of March and when we start the public comment period. So some of the things that we're doing, we do statewide news releases for notification of our public comment periods. We notify through social media and our own ODF website. We utilize mailing lists, so folks can sign up for a mailing list to be notified about state forest activities. We use that to get kind of the links and the information out to folks. We've also have done some improvements over the last couple of years, providing interactive maps with links to the documents. We use a 45-day public comment period for the annual operations plan. We do comment summaries and responses. We identify what we're going to work on for process improvements or things that we're going to consider. And then we do this. Those are kind of the big things that we do in general. Some of the processes that we're looking to improve on. So we talked a little bit about the updated AOP documents, clarifying language and providing some additional information at the kind of the operation level. So that way folks don't have to go back through kind of all the levels of our plans that we're working on. Denise talked a little bit this morning about the improved engagement with SBAC on implementation topics and really getting those planned out so they kind of dovetail in. Like we'll take what we learned today and then we're going to go out and see them in the light of the public comments that we receive to get feedback on those. And I think that will be a really interesting position there. And then also trying to identify where we're really truly just doing informational updates versus what we actually need feedback on. I'm just being more clear on that because we're really trying to understand the perspectives around any given topic. So just being more deliberate in that. We're looking into doing some informational improvements. So in the past, we've done like informational sessions. So we kick off a public comment period and then a week after we have a public meeting. We've done them virtually. We've done them at different districts to provide information kind of like this, but at a more specific level for that, or kind of a higher level, but with some different specifics, not so much focused on what we think are going to be issues, but more about the plan itself and who we are and what we do. And then we've done question and answers sessions. We've also kicked around the idea of doing some informational videos on our website so people can access, where we just basically do kind of an overview of this is what the plan is, this is how, this is who we are, this is how to comment on this, here's how to navigate the links, how to navigate to the places that you're trying to get to so you can see everything. So those are kind of, and then we've also we're still looking at updating our websites. We know we've gotten that feedback in the past. So I kind of think about those. Those are kind of the big things that we're looking to improve this year. And so if you have comments on those or additional things that you think we should consider, like really looking forward to getting some information about that. I think the biggest piece, though, that we're really focusing our energy on, because it kind of feels like it's the first step to improving a lot through some minor changes, is through the adjacent landowner outreach.
While you're still on the slide,
yeah, go for it.
did you say this, the informational improvements, some of that, there's some aspirational goals in there. I just want to make sure
Yeah,
that would be interesting to have some compact visuals, maybe even a schoolhouse rock component to the linkages.
Yeah,
might be helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
I have a comment, just as a TESMAC member. As you're thinking about the informational improvements piece, one of the things as someone who works on the land use planning of that side of things with local governments, they're required to do public engagement around their land use planning decisions. as well as other things. But let's just look at it. I'm just looking at it from the land use planning side. And one of the things that's really hard with the public, and I think this is something that the department is bumping up against a lot, is that I'm gonna everyone already knows this, but people can have a hard time and you've said this before, what level, where are their comments actually useful? Because they're giving you comments at the AOP level that you actually need at the IP level. And so one of the things I would think about is, as you're thinking about these videos or information sessions, is giving them information about at the AOP level. These are the things where we have a narrow ability to make changes. We cannot make changes about some of these other topics that people in the public are concerned about, because you're speaking to us about something, an entirely different internal process. And this is like one of the most difficult things around government, is that the public doesn't the processes. Having spent time at the grassroots level trying to work people through like land use planning processes, the process is so opaque for the general public that they literally have no idea how to engage, which is why all you're getting is like all these comments, because they really, like, I feel for them, because they have no idea, one, how to tell you what they need to tell you. They have no idea how to give you the facts that you need in order to make the changes. It's all opinion. And they have no idea where in the levels to engage. And so if you can help, what I've found is if you can provide communities that information, they'll still be frustrated, but it'll lessen their frustration, and it'll allow them to feel like they're at least plugging in the right place. And so as you think about public engagement, just think about that. And I know, I'm not gonna point your fingers, but I know you have at least one land use planner sitting at this table. And so like thinking about that from that, it's a different perspective because it's one that comes from the local government side, but I think there could be some useful pieces in that to think about. Anybody else?
Well, just one element I struggle with there, as you're saying, I completely agree. It's still unacceptable, to tell them, oh, well, that was something you should have commented on 5 years ago. That's just not an acceptable answer, right? And so like, we still have to do better, even when we explain what the process is, we still have to do better.
Yeah, and I'm not saying not to do that. I'm just saying that there are realities that are both challenging to communicate and challenging for the public to hear. And I've stood like in the middle of those, not at ODF, but in other instances. And so I'm just kind of, if there's anything in there that could be useful for you.
Yeah.
And I'm just thinking of it as an education tool. Yeah, we'll still take any comment and work through it. But if there was an education tool that's like, here are the plan levels, here are the types of comments that can help, and who to comment to in this process at the FMP or HCP level. Here's where you would comment at the IP level. Here's where you would, and the types of comments that are really effective at the AOP level.
It's not like you're shutting anybody down. You're like, we'll take it all.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Lisa.
Just one other thing. I've done a lot of outreach and education and engagement over my 20 plus years. And it's really changed now because people don't rely on local news source to get their, local information even. So they look on social media and that's not very helpful. And it's also I found it was really difficult to, have an event or something or an informational and bring people to you that the best way to do stuff is to go to them, which is high labor intensive. And secondarily, a lot of people don't even gather together anymore. Like I did education with adults that have small children. So I literally ended up going to churches that had, before church, to talk to parents, in those situations about, chemicals in the environment. And nowadays, it's just so hard to even find places where people gather. So I feel for you. If you can somehow go to them with information, and I think it has to be very narrow and detailed as to where they can put in their information relative to what stage in the process they're in. But it's really difficult. I personally think communication is the hardest thing that we humans do. And we don't spend as much money on it as we should, or as much time, or as much labor. So, so good luck. Good luck.
I don't know.
And, one of the things we're really looking at, like, it's been mentioned a couple times here, some of what you were saying, as well as the labor intensive part, is we have done these in the past. And then we find that the next year we doing the exact same thing, like over and over again. And so part of what we're trying to see is with like the videos piece is, can we do some of these canned explanations of, this is the forest management plan, this is the implementation plan. So we're not having to redo these every year. And then, staff puts together these presentations, and circling back to what we were talking about at the beginning of the meeting around just workloads and, burning that candle at both ends. When we're putting together these, it takes a lot of work, because you don't want to stand in front of a group of people and be winging it. And so you're putting a lot of staff time and effort into those. And if we're giving the same message, we want to make sure that we're being consistent, but also that people can access it throughout the year. Like, people don't just have a question, in March. They might have that question in November. And so, that's something that, as we're looking at these, we're trying to see, like, is there something that can be, utilized more than one time, so that we're not, we're using our time efficiently.
I have one other thing to say. Given what you just said about, developing videos for specific elements to the plan, or, just not having to explain the same thing over and over and over again. And when you do it correctly, if there's a way, in discussing before about how it's best to be able to go to people as opposed to them coming to you. So, few people are motivated long enough to get to the forestry webpage and to look. So maybe there's a new way in which you can solicit groups that you think are really important, and somehow invest in the partnership of them presenting your video or whatever to your group. For example, if I had, and I do, I'm on Saddle Mountain Archers group. I could post, you could have a relationship with me, and I could post your video on our Facebook page, for example. Even using me as the entry point instead of staff, something like that. I don't know. That's just an idea.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. Cheryl, go ahead.
Yeah, I've been pretty quiet. I went to the dentist recently, but I will try to move my mouth and communicate. It's even harder after the dentist. But you said there were few responses, comments, but that some of them that you received, I don't know what percent, were out of scope. And I can only speculate what they were about down here in Southern Oregon, where it's a incendiary to even bring fire-wise up. It some people are just so confused about the messaging. But I think the reason I raised my hand is to say that might have been a missed opportunity when those people were redirected to where those questions about the thing I'm not going to mention in this meeting could be directed. Would also be to say, would you mind taking a survey? Some people are like, oh, yeah, is it gonna let me air more of my whatever? But you might be able to identify like where the gaps of understanding are, like you were saying, like somebody doesn't know the hierarchy of the planning with the AOP in relationship to the FMP. And I'm over here, I have to learn all this too. And I'm so privileged to work with the ODF staff that I get to collaborate with here in Southwest Oregon, and I'm really proud. And I don't like to see them taking these kind of arrows flung at them, but if you do get some of those out of scope comments, like maybe use it as an opportunity to dig a little deeper into their miscomprehension of the whole the machine, and how things work at Salem, and how they affect people statewide.
Yeah, I like that, because then it doesn't just go into the void. They get redirected to the appropriate place, right?
I'm into surveys right now because I have a job of herding a bunch of partners in a stakeholder engagement and coming up with our governance documents. I've talking to other partnerships around the state, identified surveys as a really effective and engaging way to gather information that'll help you get your message, get it out, get it clear, clarify it.
Thank you. Any other comments? Okay.
I just have 2 more slides, maybe 3. And I can move through them pretty quickly, I think, but I think this is to kind of illustrate the point about adjacent landowners. So I'm not going to show federal or state or county adjacent lands, but just wanted to give kind of a sense of what our adjacent lands look like for the FY26 sale plan. So these are the private industrial folks that share a property line with an ODS sale. And the private industrial can go from small woodland all the way up to larger companies. And so I think the one thing to note here is it's every district does share boundaries. So that really shows kind of the shift of where the HCAs are to where we're doing our timber sales right now. And then when you get into the adjacent landowners, you see the same thing. Tillamook's the largest district, so that's not a surprise that they don't have any because they still have quite a few. They just have so many acres to work on. But on all of the other districts, there's over 50 homeowners across that share an actual property line with a sale, and that's across 16 sales. We're still working through those exact numbers because we're still generating those lists right now. But you can see why it would be important for us to standardize, and we've heard it, the engagement process, especially because this is becoming more the normal. Like, this isn't just a one-off year or a one-off couple of years. This is something that we're going to be experiencing throughout the life of this plan. So what are we going to do? So we're working on a adjacent landowner letter that will be kind of standardized across the division, with some key things that will be adapted depending on what district and what sale.
Are we going to send a map with that?
We're talking about it. So we're looking at sending the pre-op map with that, so they know if they need to go, if they care or not to go to the website, was the suggestion. And this, Dan, is something that we'll be talking, we're going to take the input in today, and then we'll talk about it next week, if that's what we want to do or not.
If our maps are volatile.
That's fair. So we're looking to send a letter, potentially a map. We'll have a conversation about that. I'd be interested to hear folks' thoughts on it. We're looking to send it about 2 weeks before the public comment period starts. The topics that kind of include who we are, what are we doing, how to engage in the public comment process. So it's, what is the public comment process? Where do you find the documents, and what kind of information, how to engage with us, where they can get the information, and then what to expect during each stage of a timber sale process. So what happens up until approval, what happens once it's approved during the sale layout and contract writing stage, what happens during actual sale harvesting and contract administration, and then what happens post-harvest. And it just kind of is a bulleted item that might be of interest of them to know kind of what to expect, what the timing is. The fact that it could be 1 to 3 years after it's sold, that it could take up to a year to sell, just to give folks some opportunities. And then they can come in and comment and ask for additional engagement if that's what they'd like through this process. That's what we have.
That you asked about the maps.
Yes.
Despite the energy I felt two chairs down, I can feel it radiating.
I should have said proposed map. Sorry about that.
No, I think I mentioned before, I got some BLM ground next to me. We got a notification with the map, and I think you just got to be confident and send it out there. And, it's kind of a no-win situation to be too afraid to communicate. You're going to attract some moths with that flame, but I think you just got to convey utter confidence and send the maps myself. Yes.
So I think some of the consternation around the map is that, we have all the report that goes into a lot of detail on what the activities are. And so if all we send is the map without the detail, then there's a lot of questions coming in.
Context for them.
If the context is we are sending out, these reports and the maps and everything here in 2 weeks, giving them notice to go, please go here and look. I think that's the consternation piece, is if you send the one without the other, then it's like, well, then what's going on? And then the districts are getting phone calls saying, I just got this map shows that someone's harvesting next to me and I have no other information. Like, what is it? Like, where are you building roads through my house? Like, what's the plan? And so, so the one provides context to the other, but we're still working on the plan. And so we may not be necessarily ready to send the plan out until we've gone to that public comment piece. And I think it's not that we're not confident in sending it, because in 2 weeks from then, we're sending it to everyone. And so it's that we don't want to give them something that then we change in 4 days after we send it to them, because we're not quite at that public period. And I think that's where there's just consternation, is once we get to that full public information process, it's like everybody has the same thing and we're there. It's I guess it's more the concern and the distrust from the other side when they either don't have all the information, or if some of their information changes if in that 2 week period.
It's a catch-22. So here we are trying to be responsive to valid criticism we heard about, it's not engaging early enough, right?
Okay.
So we're trying to get in front.
Just to answer, that's the context piece I was missing. I misunderstood that you were talking early phase, conceptual development phase, whether that is a different, I missed that piece. So that's.
However, if we don't give them the map, they're going to say, why call me and not hand me a map? So that's the rub.
But it is a different.
It is.
Well, the bigger piece to me here, Barrett, is this is addressing or giving a little more deference to the community of place versus community of interest. These are folks whose places are right next to state forests. And letting them know, here's a little personal heads up that you should be extra attentive to our public comment period, which is fairly robust compared to other even the federal agencies once it gets to the sale pipeline. But really giving some deference to that community of place. Having spent 2 months eyeball to eyeball with those folks, matter in a wet hand, with Bob Van Dyke in tow. made for some pretty good conversations. And I told him, you may not like the answer, but at least you're gonna know what the answer is. And we'll tell it to you straight up and give you as much warning as we can.
Wait, you're talking about engaging before the answers. That's why it's tough. The answers are kind of in development. So, yeah, you can probably still do it, but you just have to be just in a whole other context now you're talking to them about.
Part of the communication is just understanding that things can change, being really clear that things can change. We're giving you the best information we had today.
At the time that the letter goes out, would the web page already have planning shapes in there for those FY26 sales? So you could just add the link to that web page in the letter?
The links we're working through that right now. Whether or not that will be ready by the time we send the letter out, that is our hope. Whether it will be done yet, I don't know. And that's something that we'll have to walk through when we go through the letters on. Are we saying this will be available in 7 days? Or are we saying it's available today? I don't know yet.
To provide the link, and just like you were saying, it's at this point in time, no map available. And then when it is, it just says what the date of that change. And if you change it 4 days later, it shows that timestamp on there with that map.
Yeah.
Lisa.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, always relying on people to have internet access, especially if they're in a rural community, is not public engagement. The second thing is that, so if you are gonna put in a link, it should be available at that second that person gets it. They shouldn't have to go and then go, oh, it's not there yet. And then third, how many people are we talking about? Did you say 50 or 60?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's nothing more frustrating than going online and not being able to find what you need. And, we all know that there's very few web pages that are intuitive to our brain. And if you could put a contact name, phone number, maybe divvy up that burden. That would make, for me, that would make things a lot easier and more direct. You only got 50 people and, that way you can calm people down and tell them this is a draft, read it again, it says draft, et cetera, et cetera. That's my input. I think the phone, when people are red hot, can be helpful because they feel like they're actually being addressed. People's web pages, especially if they start getting hot, is just bad service. That's my opinion.
So I want to provide a little bit of context. There's around 50-ish adjacent private homeowners that didn't get into the private industrial, but those are people that literally have a property boundary that they share with us, not people 45 feet away or 4,000 feet away or one lot away. In some instances, that one person that shares a property boundary, maybe 30 homes. And so so to say necessarily that the workload is only 50 phone calls, it may not be. I can tell you there was more than 50 letters with Mothball Hill last year. And so,
okay.
And 50 homeowners. And so just context on that could quickly balloon, and it likely will.
That one homeowner connects with an advocacy group, who then it takes a life of its own.
Correct.
Right. Well, when you said adjacent landowner, and now you're saying that there's 30 properties on an adjacent landowner, I mean, is that an HOA? I mean,
So that I'm not using a specific example. I'm saying that these were ones that shared a property boundary with us. And so some of our properties are close to cities, close to towns. And so like, it's perfectly possible that there may be neighborhoods in vicinity to our timber sales. Some of them may not be, some of them may be a single rural house. But in a lot of instances, even that single rural house, like posting it on Facebook, then it's, you know, you're getting calls from across the country on somebody weighing in their opinion on this. And so it's being aware that, like, I think it's good. I think it's a good thing that we're reaching out to our neighbors and saying, hey, there is something near you. But it's also an awareness that, you know, since we don't yet have the product ready for them to review, by us reaching out early, there's going to be some consternation.
Yeah. I guess what I was saying was that I don't think you should post a link that's not live. And if you feel that a draft map would just make the water more muddy, then, you know, don't do it. Just gets people hot. That's all.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to highlight that in so much as the map conversation, in so much as that any way that you guys are engaging with kind of those adjacent landowners, just making sure that there's also adequate protections for your operators. And, you know, that, you know, we have dealt and will probably continue to deal with things like tree spiking and damage to property. Those are still very real threats to human life and to property. So, you know, just again, kind of, you know, being cautious about what that looks like, how it's being done, because kind of to Lisa's last point, I mean, making people angry about something kind of that they don't need to be so angry about just because you forgot to include something when your intentions were really good. I mean, there's really bad things that have happened in the past. So just being really thoughtful and mindful about you know, the people that you serve, not just those adjacent landowners, but all your other customers and partners as well.
On that, to show how far off I was, you know, in my understanding of context, you know, I'm now wondering if it'd be better to reach out to this more of an affected region. I mean, like very local, but say they're planning decisions in the works for land near you. And here's how you can engage. It might be another way to do it. If you don't really have anything to tell them, putting a map out it's almost over advertising. You're not exactly sure what's going to happen yet. So if you were to hit a set of landowners in that region and say, here's a chance to engage in discussions about property near you. Maybe that's. You know,
And that is kind of the nuance we're trying to hit.
Yeah, that's what I'm, yeah, you're touching them and you're giving them the linkage and the channels, but you're not throwing gas on a fire that's not really, organized.
And we're kind of in that close, you know, it's 2 weeks is what we're looking at right now, as far as like sending these out, and whether we should be sending them out the same day that we start public comment, and so that people are getting them right as public comment is going. So it's like, this is ongoing right now. FYI, this is adjacent to you, rather than 2 weeks before where it's confusing to folks. I guess that's part of what I would like people's feedback on, which one's better. You know, one of the things that we heard was we didn't get a warning. And so, so that's what we're trying to provide. But at the same time, I don't know anybody that gets a warning that doesn't immediately want all the details. And so I would. And so like, that's the thread that we're trying to get through. The reason that we chose the adjacent property is there's really no line that we're going to pick that somebody isn't going to be upset. If we say, within 1,000 feet, then somebody that's at 1,500 feet is going to say, why not me? If we say in a neighborhood, they're gonna say, yeah, but I can see it. And so we had to pick something. And so we picked the adjacent landowner is just something that it's like, okay, like here, at least we have something that we can be consistent with across every district every time, so that it wasn't an arbitrary decision where somebody feels like you excluded me on purpose. Because someone's gonna feel that way. There's almost no way not to, no matter what instance we choose. And so I wanted, or the group wanted to at least find something that we could like land on and say, this is repeatable every time.
I'm gonna put my land use planning hat back on. So local jurisdictions are required to send letters to all of the neighbors within a certain distance of a project, right? So if you live in a jurisdiction and they're like every neighbor within 250 feet are required to have a letter because you're going to do X, Y, or Z to your property, right? People that are at 251 feet don't get a letter. They may hear about it from their neighbor, but they're not going to get a letter, and they're not. It's not like they're excluded on purpose. It's because the governmental entity has made a decision, and so it sounds like you guys have made a decision that you can defend. And so as long as you're, as staff, you're comfortable being like, this is the decision that we've made that we're going to defend. It's going to create a certain amount of workload for us. From my perspective, that seems very valid. It really does. And the other thing that I wanted to say is that it's so interesting. There's some of us who've been in, I'm looking mainly at SVAC members, current and past, the amount of comments that you guys got just a few years ago. I remember Ron Zilli being like, there's no comments. Can you guys help us get more comments? To where we're at now is a really distinct difference. And I will also say, as someone who engages in public processes a lot, you are really, I wish that and you're doing it because you sense the frustration from the public side, but you guys are really, really like going after this. So as someone who's watching this happen, I just want to say kudos. Like it may not feel like it's really working for you. It may feel like it's creating a lot of work, but a lot of agencies would not go to this effort. And so I just want to say, as a citizen of Oregon, I just want to say thank you, because you are earnestly trying to engage in a way that's as effective and useful as possible for both you and for neighbors and others who want to engage. And it's edifying to see, even as I know it's also a difficult process and a difficult one to figure out.
You're here.
Yeah. As always, it took way too long. So unless there's any final comments on that, I'm going to close out so we can move on to the other topics. I'm sorry for everybody else. So right now, our timeline is very tentative public comment period of April 11th to May 27th. Very tentative. We've got a couple hurdles we've got to get through with the IPs to be able to hit that line, but it'll still be within those first couple of weeks of April. It's just dependent on how much we get at the end of the IP comment period. So we'll be finishing up and incorporating feedback from our specialists, from some of the district and ODF and W meetings up until about April 10th. We'll be sending the landowner letters. I have specific dates there. I think we need to reevaluate that based on the kind of a conversation that we had today. So we'll be sending them out sometime before public comment, but we'll figure out the timing in that. Public comment period, April 11th to May 27th, or give or take a couple days. The spring SVAC meeting will be May 15th to May 16th. So we'll be about halfway through or just getting ready to finish up the public comment period there. And then we have comment resolution and AOP approval between May 27th and June 30th, which is a fairly tight timeline. We've done it before, but if we get thousands of comments again, what we've done in the past is we kind of do the triage. We get all the comments that are like gonna make changes and we get through those ones first because we categorize them and then we start working on the response document. So generally we approve the AOPs once like the changes have been made and then we get things posted as comments, summary document gets finalized. So
Just to characterize some of the comments we got last year, we had one group that enlisted the help of public school kids in the Vancouver, Washington, Portland area. So they all wrote postcards with sayings, and they had to process those like every other public comment. That's all. What did that add up to? Over 1,000?
yeah, it's almost 1,100.
And that came from that one group and 3 homeowners. Turned into almost 1,000 comments.
There was one, and there was a campaign from one of the environmental groups. I think that was about 600 form letters, yeah, that were slightly different, but.
And I can't overemphasize the number of pictures for that bathroom.
Oh my God. Can't unsee that.
Like.
So just in case you were worried, your comments were.
Just so everybody knows, we do indeed read every single one.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Thanks for putting up with that. Really great feedback. And yeah, I'm done.
All right. It's 2. We're supposed to end at 3. So my plan is to just if you need to get up, use the restroom, get a drink, whatever, but we're just going to keep charging so I can get you guys out of here at 3. So Nick, you're up.
Yeah, so speaking of which, do you want to triage these at all, these topics, or do you want to just try to blow through them?
Nick, I think mine's like 5 to 10 minutes.
Okay, and I don't have much to say about this one either. We could generate discussion.
Nick, mine's like 2. I can make it 1.
All right, let's roll.
I think we're going to be all right.
Okay. Friday. Oh, let me see if I can do justice to this topic and Mike Tyson fill it out. So at the board meeting in January, I think it was, I had the great opportunity to present a carbon and climate change slide that I didn't prepare myself. That's not to throw them under the bus. It's just to say it wasn't my material. And so I made a little bit of a mess out of it. So there are questions, and that's why we're here today, right? So, backing up, we are interested and we have been directed by the board to seek alternative revenue sources, right? Carbon being an obvious one. Want to be really clear, the intent in our exploration of carbon prices and carbon markets is not to supplant timber harvest, it's to supplement. So it's to take advantage of what we're already doing and try and somehow monetize the carbon that exists on our forest. It's not, let's cut less and sell carbon. Now within that, it's really complicated. The markets are complicated. First of all, there are no markets in Oregon. There's a California market, and there are some complexities with us engaging in that market. There hasn't been a lot of political will for a market in Oregon or for carbon credits in Oregon. And when there was some will, there was language in the bill that would have carved us out explicitly from being able to participate in said markets because they didn't want us competing with industry. Sorry, that was a little bit colored, editorialized. But so as of today, no, there's not a carbon market that we can readily engage in. Most of those markets are framed in terms of additionality. And so it's what are you doing versus what could you do? And to the extent that you're not cutting as fast as you could, there's some additionality there. And that's what is often monetized in carbon markets, is that like deferring harvest piece and the carbon implicit in it. We do have in the climate change and carbon plan, there's language about setting a price for carbon on state forests. And that's a little bit of a different thing. It's our own price. It's not sort of tied to market prices. And then it would enable us potentially to enter into agreements with like individual entities who are interested in buying those carbon credits essentially. I know that's like all I know about that. So I'm gonna mess it up if I try to go further there. Within the context of our land base now, today, there's a few ways that there might be additional volume. So those are some of the things we're looking at as well. You know, off the cuff, there's a notion that, well, hey, if the conservation areas are dedicated to, you know, some other thing, then you can't point to them and say, we want the carbon credits for them because they're dedicated to conservation of habitat. However, because we can manage in the conservation areas, that makes it somewhat of a question, as there is the potential there for what we do versus what we could do. And is there some way to sort of get a carbon price out of that? The other thing is then the rest of the landscape too. And contingent on where we land, if it's not net present value 40-year rotations, there's additionality implicit in whatever rotation we land on. So if we're doing 60 years, it may be that there's something there. That's all I know. Mike, do you want to add to that at all?
No, I think you got it there, Nick. You know, it really is just something to evaluate. And unless there's, you know, something really, really tenable there, it's not something that competes with our other objectives as a project specifically. So, thanks.
Yeah, and we're talking to consultants who are working with other entities doing carbon pricing and agreements. So sort of working outside of the market framework to try and get we're talking to the folks who hooked the Elliott up with some people. So things like that, we're poking around.
Any comments or questions? Okay. Well, that was quick. Thank you, Nick. Thanks for, I think you got us right on time. Almost.
I just have one maybe quick
The less you know.
follow up. Just so I know, I mean, I'm glad that you kind of brought it up here. It was surprising to, you know, since I was sitting there in the audience. Just has that sentiment been shared with the board?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I assume so, but I don't want to make assumptions.
I'm trying to think if we've presented like in the board meeting. I mean, we've certainly had conversations and one-on-ones with them and done some kind of problem solving around that. I don't think beyond that other than the slide that I presented, we've said anything to the front of the board.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, Joe.
All right, well, I'm gonna see if I can get this to pop up there on the screen. So see if that works. I'm dangerous. Awesome. All right. So as was mentioned at the beginning of the meeting today, kind of the focus for, I guess, the next year's SBAC meetings is thinking about different plans and how that's going to be building out. And to close last SBAC meeting, there's a question about what's happening with recreation planning. And so I want to take a little bit of time today, and I will cut this short. I promise it won't go 30 minutes. We'll have a little bit here. We want to talk about what planning has taken place in the REI program historically, presently, and then also what that looks like for next steps. And so I want to start off, we can't, I will say it says REI program planning, but we're really going to focus on the recreation unit specifically. But we can't really think about the recreation unit without thinking about the REI program where it sits. So just wanted to kind of briefly touch base. The REI program is a relatively new program. Safe Forest stood up. I guess it was part of the blueprint featuring in 2018, but really kind of stood up in 2020. Obviously some major changes after 2020 with COVID and how everything operated there. And so the program has been slowly moving forward really with an eye on efficiencies and standardization. It took recreation staff from districts and really brought them into one team for those efficiencies. And we'll talk about that here in a minute. But really the idea was to have a true vision and a mission, which is going to be part of the strategic plan we'll talk about. And that is to be the pathway for all to explore, learn about, and enjoy Oregon State forests. So the REI program, just again, real quick, the REI program has 31 FTE at this point. 3 more are vacant. And that's 29 permanent staff, 5 seasonal positions, and the split and the breakdown there. Within the REI program, we have the recreation unit with 17 staff members, the education interpretation with 10, and they are spread. I think I even have some nice little stars here. There you go, spread all over Northwest Oregon area, all the different offices except for the West Oregon office in Philomath there. And so the program itself, and again, hopefully this is appearing a little bit bigger for everyone else, but we have the R side of the program with the 17 permanent staff members and the I&E with the 10. And the recreation program, we're going to dive specifically into that, is split into a motorized section, our OHV unit, which is 6 permanent staff members. It shows 5 on there, but we have kind of a split beyond. And then the non-motorized program, which is really focused on campgrounds and trails. And so I want to just kind of quickly dive into that, talk about what the program is as far as people, and also kind of, again, remind everyone when we talk about this, when we talk about, stats at the end of every fiscal year, but it's 22 developed campgrounds, 10 designated dispersed camping areas, over 60 other facilities. But then the biggest chunk of the program, quite honestly, is the trail system at this point, which is roughly 700 miles of trails across all state forest land. I do want to break this down. We talked about it a little bit earlier in the AOP aspect, but it is pretty well kind of in this order, I guess, as far as development. It's kind of Tillamook District first as far as trails, then the Forest Grove District, Astoria District, and North Cascades. And it's kind of a pretty good approximation as far as all of those categories up there are listed in that order, essentially across the different districts. So just a geographic perspective from there. What the program is, because we can't really talk about planning without talking about operations. And so operationally, obviously, all those trails require a lot of maintenance, but so do campgrounds. And so the impacts just from this last fiscal year, just under 28,000 visitors, individual campers, and roughly 60,000 visitor nights, over $300,000 of campground revenue. And then a big part of the program is volunteer hours, because the team is 17, managing that is pretty difficult. So we rely heavily on volunteers. So we're about 15,000 volunteers. And I mentioned on there that that's only camp hosts, and the volunteers we direct on the ground, like day of, that we're very aware of. That's something we'll talk about here as far as goals. So that was kind of the background. And so obviously we want to talk about recreation planning. That's what this is all about. And I think that there, rightfully so, has been maybe some frustration over the last couple of years trying to figure out what that looks like in the REI program. And I'll say, hey, I've been here for 4 years. It's been a little surprising to me. What is recreation planning? And so I've dug back in over the last 4 years and tried to get best understanding of what has taken place in the past. And so what that looks like, we've been talking about the FMP, HCP. I'll try and limit acronyms, but all the P's that we've been talking about today, they do impact the recreation program as well. And so the last true recreation planning efforts took place in 2000, essentially. Each state forest had a recreation management plan. The Tillamook, as you can see on here, is actually 1993 and was updated with an action plan 2000. So we're looking at 25 years ago was the last recreation management plan for recreation across state forest land. And that work was done looking at the goals and the strategies at that time, the current forest management plan. And I wanted to hit on this real quick. I'm not going to dive into these too in depth, but those 5 goals were diverse opportunities in rec, I&E opportunities across state forest land, minimizing adverse impacts to resources, minimizing user conflict, and then maintaining compatibility with all different things that are taking place on the landscape, essentially. Those weren't exact, but pretty darn close. And they were all informed, obviously, by the FMP. And essentially what it came out to, again, I'm not going to dive in deep on these past plans, but the past plans really did just break it down to looking at specific systems and really provided 10 years. And I think this is the important piece for us to understand recreation planning. They provided 10 years of coverage, essentially, for recreation plans, whether that was trail systems, and provided strategies for 10 years. But in 2000, that wrapped up in 2010. Obviously, there was a significant change in 2008. And that has carried us forward until 2023, the REI program, as I mentioned, was stood up in 2020. Looked back and said, hey, you know, we're now 22 years past the last action plan. So what's that look like? And I'm going to consider this kind of the rec IP revision, if you will. The idea was to create this strategic plan to bridge the gap between the original action plans and rec management plans to get us to a point we can move forward to. Again, as mentioned on here, the idea was really to bridge between the old FMP, new FMP, and the HCP. So we'll talk about what that is specifically. And this is really kind of what we have been operating off the last couple of years and will be operating off until we can truly move forward. And that's what we'll finish up with for the future plans. But the goals, and we will dive into these ones, they're actually very similar. And I think it's important to talk about. These are very similar to the goals that were set forth in the previous action plans as well. Essentially, it talks about managing I&E resources at the Tillamook Forest Center and availability of providing those resources off the center grounds as well. That's goal number 1. Goal number 2 is providing diverse funding and opportunities there. Goal number 3 essentially is building out a volunteer program, which were the same goals I mentioned previously. Goal 4 is to integrate REI into all aspects of state forest planning, essentially, and all their work, which is taking part in planning. Goal 5 really is what we're going to talk about. This is kind of the meat and potatoes of recreation planning, which is to reimagine and adapt recreation infrastructure across the landscape. And the last one is to gain a better understanding of what actually is taking place in the forest through visitor use monitoring. So at a very high level, this is the strategic plan that we've been operating under for the last 3 years. And we're about halfway through the period of understanding, I guess, of what the goals are and the strategies we're looking for. And so, again, trying to be as quick as possible here. In goal 5, which is truly the meat and potatoes of that recreation planning, we had, again, as mentioned, reimagining and adapting what we do have on the landscape. And so there were actually 10 under that first goal. There were 10 strategies. So the first 5 strategies here, again, these are all paraphrased from pretty long little bullet points. Develop a short-term operations plan, integrate with other forest activities, establish an inventory of what we do have on the landscape, so the existing infrastructure, and then an operations plan and a standards manual. And I wanted to point these out because I think that over the last 3 years, these are 5 bullet points, but there's a lot of work that goes into all of these. And quite honestly, I think this is, I know Derek has mentioned this today. I think a lot of people have mentioned this, is that we don't do a great job of telling our story at times. And the recreation program, I glossed over the REI program was created, roughly 5 years ago. But when that program did come together, you're bringing together data points from 5 different districts. And at times, even those districts had different people collecting that data. And so just understanding what's on the ground was of huge importance. So that's strategy C on here. And then everything else had to kind of cue off of that. So I'm happy to say, and hopefully everyone else thinks this is as cool as I do. I'm happy to say that we have actually completed the inventory work. So these first 5 steps, I feel pretty good about. And it's allowed us to create something, and that does not look great up on the screen. What's also on mind, what the idea is it's actually allowed us to create an inventory of what's taking place across the landscape. So this is actually Jones Creek Campground, which is our biggest campground. And each one of those data points on there is either a bathroom, a fire pit, a table, anything like that might take place. And again, I'm not sure how to zoom in on this, but if you could zoom in on the legend there, it shows all the inventory that we do have across landscape. It also allows us to understand the costs and the realities of what we are doing, which allows us to do something like this. And this is what we've actually moved towards, to be able to actually understand the infrastructure that is on the ground over the last 5 years, what quality is it in? And as you can see, we break down good, fair, poor, missing, with the idea that, hey, we need to take care of something if it's missing or poor. Everything else we can probably move forward with to meet all of our objectives at this point.
So I'd say facility assets in
Inspections.
Yep.
So we call these our inspections, essentially, just to make sure that what we have there for the assets are actually what we think we have, right? So that's within the inventory. And I call that out because, again, as I mentioned, this is about a 6-year plan. We're about halfway through at this point. And hopefully this lines up very well with the other plans that we're working towards. But there's still 5 other strategies that we need to be working towards within the strategic plan at this point. And that's really, now we have an idea of what is on the landscape. And admittedly, there's a lot more than just the facilities. We're still working on a lot of the inventory with trails. When you have 700 miles of trail, that's been a huge lift, and we're pretty well on board with that as well. But it's taking the information that we've gathered to really realize some efficiencies and then change the environmental impacts that we talked about earlier, and I'll talk about here in just a second. But then also incorporating the changes and things that we do now understand that we have, and put that into place. And those last 3 bullets, I will say, are, again, we put these into a whole lot of plans, right? And they're fairly amorphous. It's integrating within planning, which is exactly what we're doing here. But then those last 2, develop a recreation management plan and trail system plan. Quite honestly, we can't do that without having an understanding of what the HCP, FMP, IP look like. But that is the final step of this strategic plan, is getting us to that point. And then, of course, the last one there is understanding the capacity of the program partners for future needs. So again, those kind of are what we're going to wrap up here. It's going to be like 5 minutes, so we'll have some extra time here, I promise. And so those next steps, it's just kind of working through that strategic plan. So all of those 6 goals, we really dove into goal number 5. But again, we can't really separate any work in the recreation program without thinking about the larger REI program, because it does all take place. If we're talking about recreation management, we need to talk about our volunteer program. We also need to talk about funding and everything else that's involved in that. So it's going to be continuing for the next couple of years on that strategic plan. But then, and this is the important piece for this discussion here, and hopefully we have enough time at the end, but it's also operationalizing all of the impacts of the enforcement management plan, of the implementation plan, and more so in a lot of ways, the HCP. And then the last piece, and this is where SBAC really comes in, that's harmonizing the need for all the operational activities and the needs of all the recreationalists or people that are represented on this board too, or on this committee. So I want to quickly dive into the FMP. The draft FMP essentially has, I'm going to summarize this again, 1 goal for the REI program, and that's just to provide opportunities across the landscape, with 3 strategies, which are welcoming facilities across E and I and R. Also having a better understanding of what's taking place on the ground for visitor use research, and then engaging the community. So those are the 3 strategies that are put forth in the FMP, the draft. So we work under that. The habitat conservation plan, the biggest impacts, and Derek and I have been actually kind of joking as we've got a couple of emails as we're beginning to work through some of the first trails that we're trying to really bring up to spec for the HCP. But the biggest impact is going to be in terms of, again, moving all of our trail systems away from connectivity to any kind of aquatic systems. And when you have 700 miles of trail, as I mentioned before, that is a very big input. And so I don't want to shy away from the fact that will obviously be a huge part of the recreation program's work for the next 5, 10 foreseeable future years, I'd say. And then the next piece that is important with the habitat conservation plan is that we will have restrictions on the number of trails, the types of trails, the different types of facilities, and different, the HCAs, RCAs, everything else. So there are limits there from the HCP that will be impacting recreation management. And then going to be wrapping all that up into the IP, as we talked about a little bit earlier. And then I guess the next couple of years, we'll be looking to try and figure out what the IP actually does mean, and looking across, is that going to be a district level? Is that going to be an area level? How does that relate to the recreation program? And so I will be honest and say there's still a lot of work that needs to be done here within the REI program, within all the districts we work in, to try and figure out how that's going to play forward. But want to just mention that. And again, trying to wrap this up here as quick as possible. Most important piece as far as communication, we just finished talking about communication with the public, but we can't make a plan in a silo, right? And so we'll obviously have to be looking at recreation trends. And that's both the information that we've collected on our visitor use monitoring projects, which we've already done on the Black Rock trail system down in West Oregon as kind of a pilot program. And we're just starting in the Highway 6 corridor to have an understanding what our visitor use trends really are, but then also incorporating things from OPRD like SCORP, the statewide comprehensive outdoor recreation plan. And then, of course, public outreach and engagement, which is something that I think, and I am wrapping up here, I promise, something I think that SBAC is going to be a huge part of helping inform the recreation program on how best to reach out, whether that's talking about putting a map in a mailing letter or not, whatever that might be. I think there's a lot of things that we can figure out, and definitely need to lean on the support from SBAC to try and move that forward. So with that being said, I know that trying to get through that, so we had some time for questions. I know what I just glossed over, whether it be 25 years of recreation planning and 2 plans, and about I think that was 17 minutes. And so I wanted to open that up and see if anyone has any questions specifically or any thoughts regarding next steps on the recreation planning process, or Denise, if hopefully this hit the mark on what you were looking for, I guess, more so.
That looks great. And, you know, there'll be more conversation about it, but definitely if there's any questions or any points, any comments anyone wants to make, we have time. I want to allow for that. So, yeah. Cheryl, go ahead.
I was fortunate enough to be on a trail crew down here in Southern Oregon for 4 seasons, and I was not motorized. I was walking those trails. I was wondering, it seems like a large percent of those 700 miles are motorized trails. And in that context, I wonder if, since there is a lot of the people that comment on the other activities on state lands, if they're calling in or wanting to do more about riparian health, that you could get some volunteers to, as you mentioned, maybe migrate away from stream crossings if those are, 25-year-old, how it was done then kind of thing compared to how we do it now. I'd come up and have a fun day of moving the trail around, make it better for fish. But yeah, sometimes that motivates people.
Yeah, I'd say sure, come on out. We can definitely go check out a trail first out. But then I will say one of our biggest pieces of the program, as I mentioned, there's volunteer hours, excuse me. And we now have signed MOUs with 6 different volunteer groups that are mainly non-motorized at this point. We're still working on some of our motorized MOUs that do, honestly, a vast majority of the maintenance on those non-motorized trails, just because of the amount of work it takes there. And our OHV team is very heavily focused on maintenance of the OHV trails.
I'll say, yeah, for what it's worth, I mean, the motorized volunteer community has actually been way more active than the non-motorized. It's just, we're way behind in getting the MOUs in place. Kind of the non-motorized groups they're newer enough. They actually kind of are entering at the time when they're ready for MOUs. It's getting us old graybeards been out there for 50 years to modernize. It's good work.
Yeah, and I'll clean up on that, Barry. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And sorry, I didn't mean to portray that the OHV groups don't provide. It's just under different, currently under permits instead of an MOU at this point. Thanks, Barry.
There's a lot there, Joe. I mean, I'm sorry, Cheryl, did you?
No, I was just gonna throw Barrett under the bus because, only because I'm kidding, that we've been growing the non-motorized so slowly that's why. I mean, especially for Tillamook. Tillamook has had OHV riders for a long, long time. And so that's probably just why the inequity in general.
I just was gonna say about invasive species, and it's a lot easier to carry equipment in a UTV that you can buck trees out of the way and stuff than it is on a horse or hiking. So that is logical that there would be great support. But I also see a lot of, 4-wheel drive commercials that seem to encourage people to carry mud through into other areas. So I was just advocating for, if you are going to have to redesign some things because of the HCP or HCAs in your recreation, you might have to build I don't know, like a team of volunteers specific to that, maybe. I don't know.
I just didn't want to.
Yep, go ahead, Barrett.
Okay. I was saying you did a lot there, Joe. I mean, you basically packed this entire program into a speed reading presentation. So I feel like kind of material that's buried in there is worth a lot more. So I'm looking forward to hearing more. It's feels like we're, a great place, frankly. Great progress. So I had a question about, you mentioned about HCP limits on the total number of trails. Is it actually limits on the number of new trail construction?
Take this one. I can take this one. So what it is so there's a couple different limits within the HCP, and there's a little bit of a different structure to it. Specific to the miles, it's a net increase of. And so why it's written in like that is to incentivize some of these trails that are in potentially unsustainable spots or places where they're causing resource issues, that if we vacate those, we're able to use those miles somewhere else without kind of taking away from our future ask. And so that kind of incentivizes us to close ones that are causing issues because we can use that mile somewhere else without running up against our limit. The limit is just under half or just under 2 times as much, by the way, as what we have right now. So it's a pretty big bump, although it's heavier leaning towards non-motorized than it is towards motorized, for the future piece. And it also sets limits in several different categories. There's total miles, there's miles within RCAs, within the riparian conservation areas. There's total miles within habitat conservation areas. And then there's total miles within equipment restriction zones, which is the first 35 feet on either side of streams, either seasonal or perennials. And so again, the idea of that net increase is that we wanted to make sure that we weren't essentially incentivizing us to keep trails that were in really bad locations. And so we wanted us to instead incentivize us to be able to close those and then use that somewhere else without getting essentially punished for it.
Yep. Yeah, that's great. And then there are certain limits about trail design and construction constraints around owl sites and also constraints for mechanized construction within a certain number of feet of a site. And then you also can't be in a riparian area with new construction unless you're doing so to cross the stream.
I'll go through the list here for you. And so there's some operational constraints, like you said, around some seasonal restrictions around a number of owls, murrelets, for certain times of year. Sometimes it's a no-go during this period. Sometimes it's an hourly constraint on what hours. And those aren't just for recreation sites, by the way. Those restrictions are for all activities. And then it ranges through what the activities are, everything from running a chainsaw to having equipment build a road or a trail or do blasting for a quarry. There's also constraints on, like you said, some trail building standards. Most of those were very close to the road ones. And in fact, in most instances, it says roads and trails will follow these standards. There's multiple ones, but really it primarily boils down to don't deliver sediment into streams. And that's what almost all of that is focused on. There's a couple of standards that are a little more vague, but then they're clarified in what we have to report on. And so the biggest piece there would be our hydrocon piece, which is where we're seeing where our trails potentially drain towards water, identifying which portions of a trail that if water lands on it would drain towards the creek. And then those are the sections that we would call hydrologically connected. And then there is another restriction within for both roads and trails that says any dirt, road or trail that has the potential for erosion that could deliver to waters will be rocked. And so what that restriction ends up meaning is that as we go through and identify which sections are connected, we'll try to close that connection as much as we can through various maintenance techniques, water bars, rolling dips, bumps, however it is we're installing them so that we can shrink that. And then there'll be a rocking component to those places where there's stream connection. Again, with the idea of trying to limit the amount of sediment going into that stream as much as we can. And so that's a big focus, like what Joe was talking about is the more of those we can limit, the less work that there is. The more of those that exist on the landscape, the work kind of spikes exponentially. Those are probably the biggest pieces of, new items within the HCP. I mean, there's, like you said, when you go through the BMP, the best management practices, I'll catch myself in these acronyms, I swear. When we go through the best management practices, there looks like there's a really long list of things, but it really boils down to that. Don't deliver sediment into the streams. And most of it is actually stuff that we've already been doing.
And then just finally, there was an AOP engagement or AOP planning evolution that we were talking about a couple of years ago on recreation that might stretch that AOP development over a longer course of the year. Am I remembering?
I think we just have phases in the IP now, or in the AOP or the annual operations plan now, where we talk about what we're doing on recreation projects in terms of, are we planning it? Are we implementing it? So it's a stretch across those.
Yeah, I thought there was maybe some other engagement that was maybe different. But
we talked about maybe biennial.
Yeah, yeah, because I'm not really AOP time constrained is the same way that
so a lot of the part with the trails is what we started doing inside of the AOP. So with the AOPs for the timber sales themselves, there's like a lot of those sales are 3 years in length. And so one of the things that we were finding with a lot of the recreation projects is they would go into an AOP. Maybe the first year we'd be doing grant work, or we were waiting for some volunteers to help us. And then that project that's the last time it would show up in an AOP is, we showed it in 2021 and then it wouldn't show up again. And so the public, maybe that was one of their really favorite projects. They had no idea. Did we drop the project? Are we going through different planning stages? And so one of the things that we shifted last year and then we've continued is to roll over all the projects that we've had from previous years to say what it is we're doing. We've moved stages. It's currently still in construction phase, showing everybody where it's at, or that we dropped it. Like if we have projects that we're not going to maintain anymore for any number of reasons, that project was dropped, just so that people have that connection and they know what happened to it. If they go out to the area and they're like, this said there was going to be a bathroom here and it's not here and it's not in the plan. So did they decide that they're not going to put a bathroom in, or is it just in a different stage? And so now we're carrying those projects forward. The other thing that was happening with where the projects weren't being carried forward is as we'd have staff leave, nobody knew what projects were on the books from 8 years ago. And so all of a sudden someone would get a phone call and say, what about that project? I'm ready to start going today. And they're like, what are you talking about? And so there was a lot of those, and we're trying to get our arms wrapped around that too, so that we're all tracking. We all know exactly what we've approved and what we've committed to, so that nobody's getting surprised at the last minute.
And I just say, I think that's a great example. And that also allows, Dan to know what's going on his district from year to year to year, and anyone else. And so I think that's been a huge development for us. Definitely helped out in communication.
Lisa, is your hand still up? Okay. All right, great. Yes, Mike.
But I don't know that I've learned anything new here. It's still so my comments from our earlier conversation still hold, so I won't go through all that again. The nutshell of that is, when we talk about recreation planning, it's very, very, very centric towards developed infrastructure. And there is a whole nother range of recreation that occurs on state forests that feels like it's being completely ignored. And so we'll continue that conversation. To those developed infrastructure things, so my question, aside from the ATV sticker, in your campground fees, what are you doing? Are we still talking about some other mechanism, funding mechanism for these, for recreation users using these developed infrastructure type systems like the Northwest Forest Pass that the Forest Service uses, or what are we, you can see the tea leaves, funding's going to be really tight. It's not going to get any better. What are we doing with this planning, with these strategic visions to address that?
Yes, I'll first off, I'll say Mike's mentioning if anyone does want to call and ask more direct questions, like I spent a long time talking on a bunch of different things. So happy to talk more. And I still have all those notes up on my wall to run through. So
you can throw them out.
Yeah, no. But as far as funding goes, there's good question, and I don't have a hard answer for it because we don't have any hard direction that we're going. But example would be looking at parking passes potentially. Another example is looking at we know that there are, we generate revenue from our campgrounds. We have some very small campgrounds that are very full, right? And so does that mean, is that the right place for us to think about having additional sites in an area where we're full all summer long, and looking at campgrounds where we are not full all summer long, and figuring out, is there better ways for us to allocate the resources? And right now I'd say those are the two main things I can think of that we're very actively considering as far as changes right now, along other pieces, unless, Nick wants to jump in, looks like.
I saw the Sharks have a license plate. Yeah, I mean, the 1,000 ideas.
For wildlife crossing.
To build on that a little bit, we are also constrained about what we're allowed. There's some state constraints on what we're allowed to charge for and what we aren't. Justin talked a little bit about, what happens if they raise the transient tax. It means that our revenue from our campgrounds goes down. And so we're not necessarily allowed to raise those fees. And so we have to be very careful about what places we do, but it is a place that we have had conversations and we continue to have conversations on what can we, produce revenue from.
In that we spoke earlier about, your legislative concept conversations coming up. If you're going to do it and you have a vision, you need to get engaged in that now. OPRD has a pretty rigid structure that they just raise those fees on that. The federal agencies have a fee structure. There's really no reason in the recreation community, it's an accepted practice that you shouldn't be taking advantage of that. And at least, it's likely not going to fund your entire program, but it'll help.
I just said to Joe a couple of weeks back when I saw when OPRD raised their rates, are we going to raise our rates too? Or not, so yeah.
But even things like OPRD charges different rates for in-state, out-of-state, something we're looking at too. There's definitely things that we are considering. And I'd say, quite honestly, we don't have a whole lot of hard operational projects in the next year because a lot of this is focused on the internal planning and right sizing of what we can do.
One of the ironies, I'd say, of one of Justin's comments was, as legislation is passed that affects OPRD, we usually trail behind it. I would say not if it directly benefits us. And so it does when there's a restriction on it, that definitely comes down to us. But when they raise their rates, do we end up getting the same rate as well, surely that would affect them too. Not always because it's its own legislative lift. And so it's just kind of an irony that we only get the one side of the coin sometimes on that.
Right? Any other comments? Okay, I will say, we went through a lot of information. Thank you. Really, really quickly. Thank you. But this may be a topic we'll unpack a little bit more over the next future meetings. All right, just checking in because there's lots of pieces in there that we could crack way open and really dive deep. Can't do that today, but I just want to make sure everyone knows it's in the plan to continue to do that. So we have 10 minutes. And Tyson's here, so I don't know if you want to go over things relatively quickly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't have a PowerPoint, and Cheryl set me up really nicely because I do have a survey. So I wanted to talk about performance measures. The purpose of the performance measures, which are set by the board, are so the board and the public can monitor how we're meeting the goals of the FMP. And we're thinking about the draft FMP coming up. And so a lot of the performance measures are things that we already measure or monitor, or things that we plan to measure with the HCP. But what we're trying to do is bring some of the really key things up to the front so that we can be transparent about what we're doing, and also thinking about what Derek said earlier. A lot of them are celebrating our wins and showing, how we're managing our forests and how that might contrast to how people are thinking we are doing. So where they're at right now, we've had conversations with the board about the really general overview, like what are the 11 names of the performance measures going to be? And then like the specific metrics that can go into each one are still being determined. Because, I've struggled with going from, 50 potential component metrics to a more manageable number that we can actually report out on successfully. And so that's where I'm at right now. So the survey I'd like to send to you all is the same one that I sent to board members, to just gauge like how they're feeling about the importance of different component metrics, how well they speak to these different performance measures. And you can leave as much or as little feedback as you want on it. I think it really would help if, it's done this month. It doesn't have to be on the 21st like everything else, sometime this month. And, it'll help me, coming from you all as experts, it'll help me kind of make sure that we're measuring things that speak to these different aspects of management, things that are important to the public. And also it's your chance to make sure that I'm aware of the best available science with some of these different components. A lot of the ones that I'm struggling with are the social and economic things that are difficult to measure. And so I think in the past performance measures, we've been very good at reporting some of our business aspects or the inventory aspects. And that's still going to be the case. But, I have an eye on improving the social ones when we have the funding to do so. So this spring, we'll be finalizing what the components, what the different metrics are. The board meeting this summer is going to be talking about the FMP modeling scenarios that we've been doing, which I talked about in October. And we'll be talking with the board and the counties about the trade-offs between those different scenarios. And those are about how we manage the lands outside of HCAs primarily. We'll be using those scenarios and those trade-off discussions to come back to the board in September to talk more about the performance measures. Because, the performance measures and the metrics, if the board wants to set desired targets or trends for a certain metric, we need the modeling to put numbers on those, because, we can't just pull a number out of the air of, what we want our inventory to look like in 10 years, unless we have some of those models. And the intention for the board setting expectations is not to put more constraints on our planners, not to make you all do more gymnastics trying to hit particular targets, but they're meant to be indicators for the board and the public to, see how we're meeting the FMP goals, give the board and the public things to talk about, give them more information. And so at that September board meeting, I don't think we are going to, be putting numbers to every single metric, but it'll be the start of presenting the performance measures in September. And the future beyond that would be thinking about how to include performance measures and predicting, like in the implementation plans, like where we expect performance measures to be after 10 years, kind of like how we do with our harvesting.
So
That's the overall plan. And I'll send all that in an email because I know a couple people had to leave the meeting early.
So Don, maybe now would be a good time to talk about our conversation about performance measures.
sure.
Yeah, okay. So as we were setting up kind of the agenda for this year and looking to 2026, one of the places where SVEC could actually be really useful, I think you should absolutely send out the survey. But one of the places where I'm wondering, and I'm interested in SVEC feedback on this, is if there's a place where, because SVEC is focused on implementation and on the work on the ground, as the board is grappling with the trade-offs that they're seeing and what the performance measures are going to look like, we are actually a really good group that already exists to provide perspective on those trade-offs that the board is grappling with. And so if there are places where they would like some additional voices from people who have been engaged in this conversation for periods of time and look at implementation and on the ground work, that's what we do. That's what we're formed to do. I was just thinking it's a value we can bring to the board but they would need to be interested in hearing from us. And we've only engaged with them in this way. In the 15 years I've been here, I can only think of us engaging with the board in this way one other time. But they asked we said we're available and they said, yes, please. And so again, I'm not saying we do this. I'm saying that if the board was interested, I think it's something we could help them grapple with if they were interested in us doing that. Did I capture that?
Yeah, I think you did. And I think, again, as we think about how to use this group and making some connections to the board for them, right, is helpful. And that's something that the board has talked about at some of their fall off-site pieces around how to engage committees that already exist. But as you all remember, we used to have board members that would come and sit in the back and listen to SVAC. And then that conversation, I was like one of Ed Kamholtz's like most proudest moments. And I think it was like, what is the definition of sustainability? I can't remember what the term we were defining.
That was, it was something I put together around Swiss Needle Cast. It was a stakeholder dialogue process.
Okay.
Interviewed, got a facilitator, first separate meeting entirely, and then they ran a facilitated conversation that was, there were no resolutions, the SVAC didn't take any votes, but the conversation was summarized for the benefit of the board. So it's as though the board was sitting in the back of an SVAC meeting listening to us. So there were there's carefully managed depictions of the conversation. Now, some members said this, and here's why. Some members said this, and this is why. And everybody on the committee felt heard and respected at the same time. And it was great. It was great. Yeah.
Yeah.
We did something similar when Lisa Phipps was chair. We wrote a letter.
Mm-hmm. Oh, a letter.
Yeah, but we had like a very focused conversation. I can't remember the topic right now. But then everybody had an opportunity to review the letter to make sure that everyone's perspectives were captured correctly. And then we provided that to the board and in order to they wanted that feedback.
So I think this is a concept, Denise brought up and, Tyson, something to think through. We noted that we had three meetings on the calendar for this year. We talked about, would there be a separate meeting intentionally for this? That could just be virtual, that it doesn't have to be that big of a lift. But given we have this group, you all are committed to understanding our state forests How can we utilize this group, up into the board, but also, again, meet the needs of the division while we're going through this longer term planning, annual planning, could be helpful. And I think if we did like something like that to the board, it really shows that this committee structure is adding value across that governance structure of committees to the board, et cetera.
Well, I think that would also add some increased public interaction to our processes, over the last year, having folks just come to board meetings and say, I don't like this sale, or I don't like this thing. To be direct, most of those folks can't even describe what they're talking about. This is a very informed group of folks who've been hip deep in all this stuff for a period of time and can provide those valuable insights to the Board of Forestry, I think would be well received.
It was State Forester Marvin Brown at the time, and I got together to digest this question, and we found this multi-stakeholder dialogue process at the UN that was designed to capture a conversation about a difficult subject and just kind of illuminate these perspectives without having to go to war over what report got spit out. So if they want to look at that or think about it, it's a great model if we want to invest the time in it.
And the thought would be, it would be after the modeling was done, Tyson, and it would be while they were, after they'd had a chance to kind of grapple with some of this. And the other place where we could maybe provide some value would be on the places where it's harder to quantitatively measure things on the social and on some of the other pieces of greatest permanent value. Yeah. Those could be some topics that we could also help grapple with. And so just some ideas that we had, in a new, not a new way, but bring back a way that this group has been used occasionally, and just a thought of helping us, even just as SVAC members, to feel really relevant to the process that ODF is going through right now.
Yeah. There's a couple of layers too, because the performance measures are just the board's way of assessing our, success towards achieving GPV plans, goals, and objectives. But they're ultimately a subset of all the things we're measuring out there and reporting on. And so, the feedback we get from SVAC is more than just how does that inform the performance measures. It's how does it inform reporting going forward. Your comment earlier about, are you guys looking at other kinds of habitat or just old? So relevant to this discussion. We've been talking with Brenda McComb about it too, within the context of the performance measures, but having SVAC, having OHA's opinion on what other habitats matter is invaluable to the discussion. The social piece too, we're just weak on it. So things like that.
So if there's, we'll talk about this again in May, but just kind of wanted to line us up for a potential summertime meeting. More than, I think it would be fine to do it virtually, and it wouldn't be all day, it'd be like half a day. So we wanted to have you come and speak about the performance measures, and then also toss this out there as an idea.
Yeah, love your idea. Thank you.
Yeah.
Just really quick, Nick, or maybe Mike, if he's still on, just reminding us of the timeline for the board on when they're going to have those models, and then when the discussion is going to be on the performance measures to start doing that kind of weighing, just trying to figure out, how we fit in to that conversation.
I think Mike's gone. I believe we are looking at June now to present the model scenarios, the outcomes, and so the trade-offs associated with them, which feed the performance measures discussion, but we're not finishing it there. And so September, I believe, is ideally we're wrapping up what the board tells us what they want, what the performance measures are and where they want us to land. June is here's the model scenarios.
So it would be after the model scenarios.
So that would be May. Well, I thought you just said May.
No. I said like, I was thinking June, July, but it was after the June.
Okay.
Mike, did you have a comment?
Just wondering, Tyson, there's, performance measures can go a bunch of different ways there. Some are very specific in terms of monitoring or evaluating things. And then there's kind of other ones that are more, and I can't think of the right word. I'm thinking like, in a wildlife term, like an indicator species, or a surrogate for kind of measuring some portion of GPV. Is all that pretty much on the table here at this point, do you think, or what's the board kind of indicated here?
The board has had very different opinions about, the level of detail is very different between board members. And in this group, I'm sure too. So you'll be able to see kind of the level of detail I'm thinking of in the survey with the different components. I'm looking to simplify, but if there are suggestions for better components or more relevant ones, I'm really happy to hear that and consider that.
It depends on the metric. Like carbon is one example you use of, it's probably not a target, right? It's probably a trend or a threshold. Where do you want to, and so we're trying to get the board anchored into that too. Like, hey, do you want us to be a net sink? That's the goal. It's not some,
Right. We're also trying to land on something that we can say whether we're succeeding or failing at. In the past, some of our metrics were pretty nebulous. And so it was, I guess, up to the interpretation of the reader. And so we're trying to avoid those because I don't know how helpful those are.
There's value in that.
Well, just one other comment, just because I've been working on this for a while. To my understanding, and I just want to make sure that this is right, like the role of FFAC is really in this process is sort of identifying what component metrics we feel like should be included. It's the board's job to identify what that target or that goal is, right? So it's not us saying, well, we think that this component metric should, the goal should be X, that it should be this many trails, or the trend should be this, or it should be a trend, or it should be a trend.
and I don't know that would preclude you from saying so. I mean, I think that's important for the board to understand. If you guys have a unanimous perspective on that, that's really informative, I think. So.
Yeah, so if there was a unanimous perspective, we could indicate that. If there were three different perspectives, we're not going to be taking a vote on it. Like, we're not going to be deciding on anything. This is more of a, like what Barrett described, which is capturing the conversation and the perspectives across the stakeholders in the room.
And would the survey inform that discussion then? So looking at the survey, because the survey, I think it's just focused on the specific components.
It's on the specific components.
And looking at those, and then, so we'd have that information to know maybe where there was alignment, maybe where there's misalignment. And then the conversation would be, are there additional things maybe missing or weren't captured, or people came back and thought of different things? And then the follow-up conversation would be, now, what do we think the actual target should be? I mean, is that really the intent?
No, because so the targets, I think when the board looks at the FMP scenarios and kind of gives us more direction on what they envision for managing outside of the HCP compliance. Like, I think when we have that direction, it won't necessarily match up exactly with one of the scenarios we present, but it might be a mix of some of these approaches. And we can then look at the modeled results, especially for the ones that are inventory based, and then see how they would line up with performance measures, like the specific metrics that we can line up with our models. We could say, the board told us to manage like this. based on these scenarios, we think the performance measure will grow by this much in the first 10 years. That would be the start. But like, you know, I am well aware of kind of the fallacy of, you know, trying to pick a number out of a model and then managing towards that target. So,
Okay, I'm trying to gather like in my.
And I don't think we have the framework for it. And I was just more like wanting to see if there was interest in doing it, because if we need an additional meeting. And to see if, we hadn't talked, I fully put Tyson on the spot here today. And just kind of get a sense because if the group was like, we don't want to touch this, then, but I think there's a sense that the group would be interested in at least a conversation.
Yeah.
And we can kind of see, like, we can do the survey and see what comes back from that. We'll see from what the board's discussion, what the modeling brings forward, and then we can begin to frame the conversation. But I don't even have like a really clear idea what exactly it will look like. It's more, I think it will line itself up, I think, over the next several months.
yeah, that's it. The board hasn't decided like how they want to interact with the performance measures yet, so it's hard to give you a good answer. But I mean, anything performance measure wise, target wise, I think is fair game for you know, advocating the board to do a certain thing, because it's all meant to be public facing monitoring. So
We've been
have at it.
trying to get them to like, if you want targets, they should live within IPs and they should be tied to some goal for a 10-year period. Early cereal habitat, for example. Brenda, you want complex early cereal? How many acres over the next 10 years? And then that's in the IP and we're accountable that way, right? And so in a lot of things, we're trying to sort of get them pushed off of this is the plan's target to this is what we intend to achieve over the next 10 years.
I'm really feeling my age. This sounds like the 1995 Board of Forestry meeting in Klamath Falls.
Is that on YouTube?
I suggest
for that or.
I think all these Board of Forestry meetings should be in Klamath Falls.
Here's some Mobius strips I sent to people lately. Mobius strip. There we go.
But I mean, that's where they came, and then it had some SFAC input into it. And I don't mean this, I really mean this, that you guys are way more informed than our general public, and I would say maybe some of our board members about what it actually means, what those policy pieces mean on the ground. So there's not a better group to provide them some perspectives, even if it's a spectrum of perspectives.
Yeah.
To what their decisions mean. So I would encourage you to do as much as you can tolerate.
Thanks, Dan.
Yeah, that to me is exact value as opposed to just random members of the public who have value too.
Well, I'm sorry, guys. We went over by 15 minutes. Thank you for your patience and for this discussion, but I didn't want to walk away without having this conversation. Next meeting is May 15 and 16. We're going to do a tour. I think we're still figuring out location, but we'll get back to you with that. And then, so it's a Thursday and a Friday. We'll have the tour on Thursday. So I think, yeah. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great weekend.
You too.
Thank you.
Plug you, Joe. Oh, thank you very much.